So now we're looking at a poem by Amiri Baraka called Incident, and the poem was published in 1969, some years after Baraka, as Leroy Jones, was closely associated with the Beats, but I still think it's a good poem for us to end on in this chapter. It's called Incident. So what happens? He's talking about an incident. Something happened. Amaris, what happened?
A man was shot and we're faced with the sight of the corpse. And it was probably a hate crime for racial nature.
Seems to be? How do you know that?
Pictures of the dead man. He died in darkness, darker than his soul.
Okay. Although the killer knew the victim, we know that. Anyway, who's he?
And who's him, for that matter?
And who's him?
Yeah.
It's kind of that pronoun ambiguity.
Yeah, and in chapter 8, John Ashbery, with a very different kind of poetry, is going to do a lot with that. He came back and shot. He shot him. Why confuse the... Both are the male pronoun, third person. Why do it that way? Molly? Why does Baraka do it that way? Confusing.
It is. I guess because what's important here is the incident itself, the shooting, and who did the shooting and who the victim was.
Wow, how radical of you. Let me read the first stanza and you can say more about that.
Sure.
He came back and shot. He shot him. When he came back, he shot. And he fell, stumbling, past the shadow wood, down, shot, dying, dead, to full halt. Why write like that?
I mean, it really reminds me of Gertrude Stein.
Yeah, sure it does.
And the fact that you can't directly represent with a traditional sentence a crime like this, an event like this. You're fumbling for the right words to show what you're seeing. Because it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. If you describe a murder in very clear terms, distinguishing the subject from the object or distinguishing the killer from the victim, then you make much more coherence out of an event that's quite incoherent and disturbing and confusing, so that the writing creates the openness and the not knowingness that's so crucial to understanding the incident. Okay, so what else does he do? It's not just that he confuses the pronouns, but you were talking about Stein. When he came back and shot, he shot him. When he came back, he shot. That sounds very repetitive.
Time is messed up.
Time is messed up. Dave?
He also came back, and the poem says he came back at least 3 times, which implies that they came from the same spot originally.
Well, either that. I mean, he does say he came back, but either that or that this is almost a cubistic rendering. This is like the police report turned into cubism. Why all this emphasis on what we know? Allie, why is it important that to know what we know and what we don't know?
Well, I think one of the reasons that, there's this kind of cubistic method of representation is that it almost seems especially in that first stanza, that he might not be able to decide what the best way is to represent it. And with an incident like this, and of course the title harkens back to Incident
Countee
that we already
Cullen.
read by Countee Cullen.
Do you think it seems like it would be, it's a very famous poem by Countee Cullen, so it should strike us that this is a deliberate reference to Countee Cullen's incident, which does make it seem like somehow race must be involved, or racial hatred, which is what that other poem is about. Okay, go ahead.
And Countee Cullen can't ever forget about that. There's still this sense in that poem that he could never quite make amends with it or make peace with it. And here, we know nothing other than these, even though we are given a lot of information, the fact that there's still so much that isn't known kind of just sums up this whole, there's no right way to express it, to make it be a coherent incident.
And that to me is why this poem is so much more successful than Countee Cullen's, because Countee Cullen makes it pretty easy and he makes
it coherent
and he has his
for
own
the
reasons
purpose of making sure we remember.
that we remember and we understand. What this does for me is makes it very not easy, because murder is not easy. It's not easy to understand. It's not easy.
It's not easy to understand how they could have known each other, right? And how it's possible in a situation like this, and this is the way, shall we just call it modern violence is, it's not even clear who's the killer and who's the victim. In fact, it might even be possible for them to be reversed. That's how desperate the situation is in our lives. So I'm kind of with you. I appreciate the fact that Baraka is making this hard to understand, because he's using a writing that gives honor, if that's the right word, due honor to the complexity of this violence. What is this stuff about we have no word?
I think it's kind of exactly the opposite of County Cullen's incident. In that poem, everything really rests on one word. It's the N-word that is the trauma that shocks you out of the poem. And here, there's no way to say the event, the trauma is unsayable. There's no way to accurately depict it or represent it.
We have no word, we have no language for this. But it works doubly, because it's also, without punctuation, we have no word, continue on the killer.
Right.
Where do we hear that language? Where's that vocabulary from?
Newscast.
We have no word this afternoon at 6 o'clock, we have no word on the killer. And where else? It's also police report talk. We have no word. We have no word on the killer, except he came back from somewhere to do what he did. So we have no word. Let's go to the end of the poem. We know the killer was skillful, quick, and silent, and that the victim probably knew him. Other than that, aside from the caked sourness of the dead man's expression and the cool surprise in the fixture of his hands and fingers, we know nothing.
The turn is really interesting, from we have no word, and all of a sudden, after that, it's the killer and the victim. It's more delineated on who is who. It's not he and him. He shot him, he came back, he shot and he fell. After we know word, it's on the killer, into his victim's stare and left him quickly. We know that him is referring to the victim. We know the killer was skillful. It's an interesting turn in the...
Yeah, I agree. What does the phrase "we know nothing" mean? What import does it have in this situation?
Well, because they obviously know something, right? And even a sort of surprising degree of things, knowing about the cake sourness and how his fingers are implies a lot of specificity and a kind of a personal experience of that. And to have that sort of that sort of data of knowledge, and then say after that, we know nothing.
So that means that there must be a higher level of not knowing that's at work here. What's that higher level?
Of knowing why these things happen, of knowing what they mean, of knowing how to represent them.
How to represent them. Let us describe how they went. Oh boy, I don't think I can do it. These are my people. They died. I can't do it. Language doesn't work. I have no word for this. And I want my poem to represent that not knowingness. I don't want to cheat. I don't want to make it coherent when it's incoherent. I want life's and America's incoherence to be in the writing. We know nothing. Amaris, what else don't we know? In the largest sense that Emily was starting us on.
New racial relations that wouldn't breed this type of violence and how to create them.
We know nothing about that.
At this point, that language hasn't been created. The word from County Cullen's poem here has been transformed into a bullet. And so we see how the seeming innocuous nature of that experience of one young boy to another, not understanding what that word meant and its adult implications, here has reality, and there are no words left to describe the pain and sorrow of what happened there.
So far, all the poems that we talked about in this chapter 7, the beat poems, so-called, have all had an antic side to them. They've all been seeking pleasure and funny at certain points, even the grimmest moments of howl. This is the one that seems pretty angry. Maybe that's evidence that it doesn't have a relationship to the beat aesthetic, but What's he angry about?
Maybe the presumption that you could know, that implicit in all police reports and all newscasts, that knowing is possible.
And the kind of journalistic and police reporting language that acts as if it's just a matter of denotation. You know, you accumulate a certain number of facts and that somehow suggests that you know something. So there's anger there. Anybody else? Where?
Because there's such a distance in that language. You know, even the, you know, the victim was shot at this time on this day, you know, at this place, you know, by this person. You know, like there's such distance there that like you become desensitized to what happened.
And Baraka is saying in contrast that he died in darkness darker than his soul. So he's willing to go to blow deeply there. I know a man, and what can we do against this darkness? Well, one thing we need to do against this darkness is to write like this. Use the confusion of pronouns, polyptoton, which is a rhetorical device that John Ashbery likes to do so that we don't know who's being talked about, because that's the way the world works. All right, let's get some final words on this. Emily.
It's I don't know, it's just very moving, right, to say we know nothing and have that be a sort of morally confident declaration of taking pride in having that ignorance and being able to call it ignorance.
Okay. Final words, Amaris?
In the third stanza, he said pictures of the man are everywhere. So even though the words don't exist, the police report that can't hope to encapsulate all his life and reduce him just to the identity of victim are sort of compensated for by that image that was so important to the beats, the image and the sound, which he enacts and replicates here in the form of the poem.
It's also nice to see how, if this, to the extent that this is a beat aesthetic, how the beat aesthetic draws so much from Steinian repetition. It's a nice, we need to think of modernism as continuous and leading to the beats at this point. Dave, final thought?
I think going off of what Anna said about the distance, part of what Baraka may be saying is that this is an incident that happens all the time. We don't know much about it, and the problem is that we don't really care.
Okay, good. Allie, your thought?
I think it's interesting how it kind of starts off more confused than it ends. Whereas I feel like in things we've come across so far, it tends to kind of deconstruct the other way around. And there's just something, it's effective because it's demonstrated first, and then finally we kind of get a middle, especially with a we have no word. We have a center of kind of replication of the usual like reporter, journalistic type of recording something, and then at the end, that final declaration, we know nothing. This isn't effective, this won't work.
Okay, good. Anna?
I have no word.
You have no word, Molly?
No word.
I think we know nothing is just such a beautiful way to express the state one is in after a trauma like this, where like, who am I, where am I, what day is it? I have no idea.
I think to add to what Molly said, there's almost like masterful rhythm between these sort of moments of not knowing and confusion, and then moments of knowing and having details and having something you can report. So when he's just struggling for the words, but then he can say something as sort of like profound as his spirit sucks up the light, which is a sort of judgment, or an assessment or an analysis or a detail or something that's completely situated against these sort of frustrated and struggling descriptions like wood down, shot, dying, dead.
Well, I'll take a shot at a final word. I'm wrestling with where the anger comes from. I admire this poem very much, and I think it's easy to misunderstand Baraka's radicalism here. I think it's not so much that he's anger against the murderer or about the victim, on behalf of the victim. And it's easy to misunderstand him and say, oh, Baraka's somehow making this complex and kind of he's confusing victim and murderer, and that's a that's just such an easy radical thing to do, and it sort of excuses this kind of behavior. Not at all. I think he's not so much angry at that as angry at a system of representation that so utterly fails to describe such a thing. And that's the thing that he wants to radically reinvent, or participate in the poetics that makes us focus on the paucity of our means of representation, which is almost word for word what Allen Ginsberg used to say. We are impoverished in the way we can describe this kind of stuff, and that's what makes the situation worse. It's possible to imagine this kind of violence lessening or even going away if we can figure out how it is to represent exactly what this is. In the meantime, we're left failing to do so and knowing nothing.